Welcome to the first of our Parliament Unpacked programs for this year. I too also want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to welcome the live audience here today in the Legislative Assembly chamber, as well as all those across New South Wales who are joining us through our live stream. Parliament Unpacked is a new series of visitor programs organised by our Parliamentary Education and Engagement team that look behind the scenes at the workings of the oldest parliament in Australia. It'll be an opportunity to engage with our parliamentary system, the Westminster system of governance, the people who represent us, and get an idea of what happens every day in Parliament. And in this first iteration of Parliament Unpacked across the aisles, we meet with members who will share their experiences of working together as representatives of diverse political parties. Today we have 4 Legislative Assembly members with us. We have Felicity Wilson, James Griffin, both who are members of the Liberal Party and part of the government. The government sits on this side when Parliament sits. And then we have Jihad Dib from the Labor Party, part of the opposition. And finally, Jenny Leong, a member of the Greens and the crossbench in the Parliament. You'll hear about all of their experiences, how they've built working relationships with many other members in this chamber, how they work with constituents to bring about changes to legislation and other changes in their electorates, what it was like for each of them to be a new member of Parliament in this place, and how their journey here has developed since the time that they were first elected. They'll speak about some very interesting aspects of working in this place, the Legislative Assembly of the New South Wales Parliament. And this place is also known as the Bear Pit because of its reputation as a rough and tumble arena that you often see most at its bearish in question time. Like the judicial system, Parliament's designed as an adversarial system where, through debate and discourse in this and the other chamber, the Legislative Council, the hopefully best decisions for the majority of people in New South Wales can be forged. And indeed, this place can be a very lively and exciting place to work in and also to observe. I have a role as Speaker, and in a broad sense, 3 functions as Speaker. One is to help with the presiding officer in the other place, help oversee the running of this place. There's about 300 staff, and together with the 2 clerks and the CEO of Department of Parliamentary Services, the 5 of us, in a broad sense, oversee the running of the Parliament and the precincts with about 300 odd staff. Second function is as a spokesperson of the Legislative Assembly and the Parliament, particularly engaging with external bodies, some of them oversight bodies, some of them diplomatic corps, and indeed other stakeholders who want to engage with the Parliament. But the third and the most visible and certainly at times the most onerous and exciting and perhaps difficult role is trying to chair this chamber. Now, today we have 4 very well-behaved members, and you're going to have a chance to hear from them. So welcome to our program today. We are so pleased, all of us, that you've been able to join with us in this great panel of members in this 57th Parliament of New South Wales. Thank you, Rita, and over to the members.
Great, thank you very, very much indeed. Now I'll just do a very brief introduction about our Parliament, just so you have a little bit of a background. I know that you're all probably very well versed with our Westminster system of Parliament. We have both a lower house and an upper house. You're very well aware of that. Both houses are made up of a very wide range of political parties elected by the people every 4 years to represent them. In the Legislative Assembly, we have 36 Liberal members, 12 National members, So there are 48 members on the government side, and it takes 47 members to form government. So there is a majority of one in this House. Labor has 36 members in its party. There are 3 Green members in the chamber, 3 independent members, and 3 shooter, fishers and farmers. So we did mention that we're bicameral, with a lower house and an upper house. The upper house is the House of Review. And an important distinction between the upper and lower houses are that the members represent in the lower house their electorates, and in the upper house they represent all of New South Wales. We are not only a working parliament, we have a couple of other interesting historical firsts to this site. We are the oldest parliament in Australia, and this building is the longest serving public building in Australia that was built in 1816 by Governor Macquarie as part of the Rum Hospital. And we are also the parliament in which the first Prime Minister of Australia cut his political teeth, and that would be Edmund Barton, who here in the New South Wales Parliament served as Attorney General, Speaker of the LA, and member of both the upper and lower houses at different times of his career before moving on to the federal government after Federation. And he also headed that Federation movement after Henry Parkes passed away. So today we will take a look at the workings of the Parliament. We mostly think of the Parliament as adversarial in nature, and as mentioned before, we think of this particular Parliament and its Legislative Assembly as a very kind of rough and tumble kind of place, and it's also known as the bear pit because of its activities in question time, and our members will probably refer to some of those experiences. But while this is the popular view today, we want to tell many of the stories of cooperation, collegiality and collaboration perhaps through some of the other many activities of the Parliament. So I'll open to the members present here today to talk about their personal experiences and unique perspectives in what takes place in the Parliament working across the aisles. So we'll start with a very quick 2-minute introduction from each of our members present here today to talk about themselves and to tell us each how they came to be here, and possibly combine that with a little bit about what you do in the Parliament and what you do in your electorates and how that differs and how it's similar in some ways. So perhaps we'll get the member from Manly, James Griffin, to come up and speak first. And we'll work our way around the room.
I was going to say. Are we setting the timer, or do we need to time ourselves?
Two minutes.
You can say, do you want to time him? You can time him as well if you wish.
It's useful for us to have. We're not used to speaking in here without a clock.
Okay.
It's already started. So the interjections have already started. So we haven't even got very far. But
hey, hecklers, we're ready.
Rita, thank you, and to the speaker, thank you. As Rita said, I'm James Griffin, and I'm the member for Manly. So I've been here for 4 years now, which is, by some standards, not a very long time in this Parliament, but every now and then it feels like a very, very long time to have been here. I don't think there is really a straight line to Parliament for many people that enter this place. There are many different reasons of how we've all gotten here and how and the way in which we spend our time. But personally, I grew up in a military family, so both my parents were in the Australian Army, and we had a very nomadic lifestyle growing up, and eventually settled in Manly back in 1997, and that really was the first place that we as a family felt as though it was a true home for us, because we knew we weren't going to be posted anywhere else or move on to anywhere else in Australia after we settled there, and so we really immersed ourselves in the community. And then through a variety of different decisions and reasons, I ended up as a member of the Liberal Party. And then in 2017, the former Premier Baird, decided his time had come in this place, and I took over from him following a by-election in 2017. So it was a pretty swift, I guess, moment from him choosing to no longer be the member for Manly to actually arriving in Parliament. It was sort of January that he made his decision, and by April there'd been an election, and I found myself in here. So The learning curve was incredibly steep, and I think that the learning curve continues to be steep because, as the members will explain to you, the diverse role of the job is just phenomenal. From last night, going out and doing a homelessness street count on the northern beaches, which saw us out quite late at night, through to opening a school this morning, and then everything that goes on between that. But it's a privilege to be here. There's not a day that goes by that I don't walk through these doors and sort of, really appreciate the opportunity to serve a community and do it amongst a setting that is steeped in history and with people from the most amazing diverse backgrounds that really do test your perspective on what you think you know and what you think is right. But at the end of the day, it's funny, I think all members in this place really come to embody their electorate that they represent, certainly in the lower house, and you start to see that. They might not notice it, but watching other MPs, you sort of do observe that. So Manly's a beautiful part of the world to look after. It's a privilege to do that, and I want to thank you all for being here today, and for those of you that are watching online, hopefully it will be a useful introduction to some of the work that we do.
Thank you. Okay, I think we might go across the aisle rather than around the aisles. Yeah, so we'll go over to Jenny. Jenny Leong, member for Newtown. And I've got the timer on.
That's all right. I'll put my own timer on, otherwise I'll talk forever. You. It's a high risk I have. I'd also like to join by acknowledging that this Parliament and the electorate that I represent, which is the electorate of Newtown, is on Gadigal land, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and it's important for us to commit not just in an acknowledgement but also recognise there is more work to be done in this place and throughout the state to look to fight for Aboriginal justice for all people. I was elected in 2015 as the member for Newtown. It was a newly established seat, and I take James's comment as that we're embodying our electorate as a compliment, because at the time Anthony Green, who's the ABC election analyst, described it as the smallest and funkiest new electorate in Newtown. So I'm going to in New South Wales. I'm going to claim that as a compliment now, based on what James said. It was a brand new seat created because there needs to be a level of balance between the number of people represented in each area, in each electorate, and so the density of the inner city means that we've got a brand new seat set up that had never existed before in its current form, and so there was no sitting member. And for a Greens candidate, that is a good thing, because it's very, very hard to break the stronghold of the incumbency of the existing member, so having that opportunity was a strong one. And I personally had a strong connection to the Newtown electorate, where every house that I had rented or lived in since I moved to Sydney from Adelaide as a 19-year-old was located within the electorate, and every job that I had, apart from when I worked in London and Hong Kong for Amnesty, was also located in the Newtown electorate. So fairly a small area, but one that I felt very connected to. I got involved in politics, again, not through a very straight line. I was doing theatre, my PhD in the need for a theatre archive in Australia, which we still require. We don't have a national theatre archive. And the focus on race and division and the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees meant I spent most of my own life yelling at the television whenever I was watching the news, and I didn't think that was a particularly useful way to engage with society. So I decided to get involved. I joined the Greens at that time, and then through that time I was more or less active in the party at different stages. I then took on a global campaign role working for Amnesty International around the Burma elections, which sadly we're seeing a return to a military dictatorship in that country right now, and also supporting activists in the Middle East and North Africa uprising. So I went from a global role to a micro 11 square kilometres in the heart of the inner city, and my role is now a very challenging one in many ways because of that, because I come to my politics with a sense of a global perspective and a sense of a human rights background, a sense of a recognition of the way that we're connected internationally. But I also have very hyper-local responsibilities as a local member. This morning, and we talk about what we're doing in the last 24 hours, this morning I was in a public housing community room in Surrey Hills, literally pulling old sticky tape off the wall. I got changed before I came to this, but but I was pulling sticky tape off the walls, helping to get rid of old shopping trolleys and resetting up that community room because it's been closed down because of COVID and now it can reopen. Working with volunteers and people that work in housing to make sure that that room was functioning. And last night, I got to go to the reopening of the Enmore Theatre, because that is one of the cool things about being a member for Newtown. And they watched Cold Chisel and others all play in the Enmore Theatre in a redesigned, incredible space. So it was truly a remarkable example of the kinds of things you do as a local member day to day. In the middle of all of that, I'm attempting to redraft consent laws so that we can change the way that consent laws are done. So it is a very, very crazy way that we intersect, and I look forward to talking to you more about it as we go through the discussion.
Fantastic. It's wonderful to hear about all our different members and what they get up to outside of Parliament as well. I think it's really important. We will go over to Felicity Wilson from the North Shore now. And I don't know, I think we've breached the 2-minute timing already. So, yeah.
Just take it off.
That's right. Okay, thank you.
That wasn't in my 2 minutes, right? Thank you, Rita, and thank you, Mr. Speaker, for being here, and thank you all for being here. It's very exciting to see people in the chamber. We haven't had people inside the chamber besides our colleagues for quite some time with COVID, so it's really exciting to see people in here, and I hope you feel very welcome. And for those of you watching from home, this has been a very interesting year for the world, and it's changed a lot of things in here, but it's very exciting for us to see people in person, because that's one of the things we thrive on when we're speaking in here, knowing that someone's actually listening, that we're trying to be representative, but that people are actually hearing our voices, because what we're doing here is speaking on behalf of our communities. And that's one of the things that brought me into politics, is my personal background and story. You'll find that from all of us. I didn't grow up in Sydney. I was actually born in Cessnock. I'm the youngest of 3 girls. My mum was a single mother. My father was an undiagnosed schizophrenic who'd been quite violent when we were young. And for me, the peripatetic lifestyle that we led, a lot of, I guess, the disadvantage and the challenges that we faced growing up meant that I had a really strong focus on issues like domestic and family violence, education, because I think that changed my life, and some of those different policy areas resonated with me. I also had a very strong influence from my grandparents growing up, and my grandparents had gone through the Depression, World War II, and had instilled in them these very strong values of community service, contribution to others rather than just yourself. And so that was, because I had my single mother, they were very influential in our lives. And so when it came to getting involved in politics, I'd studied a little bit of it. I didn't really like university politics, but then after my undergraduate, I started working for Joe Hockey through a friend. I really liked Joe, and I really liked working there, and then he lost the 2007 election, the federal election. And I then, after that, kind of joined the Liberal Party, and over time got to know quite a bit of it, and then went on to fulfil internal representative roles in the Liberal Party. So I was, for 3 years, the president of the party's Women's Council here in New South Wales, and I was also vice president of the New South Wales Liberal Party. And so I got a bit of a sense of running for things and contesting things and being challenged and trying to represent individuals. And my local member was Julian Skinner, who was the health minister at the time, and after Mike Baird stepped down from Manly, Julian chose to step down from North Shore. So then I had a slightly shorter run than James, but very similar period of time between her resignation, a very tight pre-selection process, and then I think we had 23 days between pre-selection and by-election. And by-elections are really tough. Governments can be very concerned about losing by-elections and what that will mean for the status of the government and the credibility and reputation of the government. But James and I pulled through, elected on the same day, almost 4 years ago, re-elected 2 years ago, almost now, and in that intervening period, we've each expanded our families by 2 children each. So a lot's happened to us in that period. The things I do here on a daily basis, obviously we're in the chamber speaking out on issues that are of importance to our communities. I spend time with ministers and their staff talking through the same issues and trying to get outcomes. We do a lot of work with committees, which I'm sure we'll move on to. I'm on, I think, 4 committees now, but at the beginning of this term I was on 6, which is probably more than most. And I also fill in a little bit for Mr. Speaker. I'm on the Speaker's panel, so undertake some temporary Speaker duties and responsibilities, also presiding over this chamber in less contentious circumstances than Mr. Speaker does. So that takes up a lot of my time in this chamber. And I'm happy to talk about those items or more of the community and electorate items as we progress.
Thank you, Felicity. And now we have Jihad Dib, member for Lakemba.
Thanks, well, Rita, I'm going to put my timer on. And good afternoon, everyone. And of course, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and pay my respects, well as past and present. I want to thank the Speaker and Education Department for putting this on, and also my colleagues for giving up the time. What you'll see really clearly is the thing that we love doing is spending time in our communities and representing the people that need us there to represent them. But the thing that fills our cup, and if we use the phrase fill in the cup, is often the things like, the painting, the homeless run, assisting constituents who need a hand. And this morning, the thing that brought a smile to my face was an elderly gentleman came to us yesterday. I had a problem with his eyes, was told that he couldn't get it sorted out, and we were able to get it sorted out within a day. And it was really terrific, because that's the really good thing about politics. We didn't go political, just made a couple of phone calls, and what we'll have is a gentleman in his mid-90s will be able to get what it is that he needs. Like Jenny, I came in 2015, and my background's similar and different, and probably goes to show how everybody's got a different story if you peel some of the layers. We came here when I was 3 years of age. We came from Lebanon fleeing a war. Parents always interested in politics, and one of my earliest memories is Dad driving around in our Datsun 200B with a Neville Wran call flute and driving around. It's funny how there's lots of things that I don't remember, but I remember that. So they've always been interested in politics. But growing up, it was not really considered for us because, we couldn't speak English. We were quite poor, and we remain quite poor. But we worked together really, really well. And it was one of those things that we never thought would happen. Fast forward a whole number of years, and my career took me to education. So I tried a few different things. I went to education, and my final gig before I came in here was as the principal of Punchbowl Boys High School for 9 years. And that was the thing that really gave me, I suppose, that rev up in life that you can actually really make a difference, because that's a really good example of something that people have given up on, that that you can change a trajectory if you really believe in it, and you can change things. So decision was made. Funny, my wife will say, I said to my wife, I never thought I'd go into politics. She said, Jihad, from the moment I met you, I could see that you were going to go into politics, but I'd never felt it like that. So it wasn't like we'd had this plan, then I joined this party, and then I did this. It just kind of happened. I always felt that I wanted to be a member of the Labor Party. That's what I believed in, and I still believe in, obviously. And we went through those steps that we had to take, basically, to get me up into an election in 2015. And I'll never forget my first election, because having a name like Jihad is not the easiest. Okay, that's it. Now, how do you no, wait. No way, that was 2 minutes. Hang on. Having a name like Jihad isn't the easiest when you come into a parliament. And I do recall that somebody had suggested that maybe it might be a good idea to change your name. And it was a decision that I made that I wouldn't change my name. Because if I changed my name, then it actually took away the things that I stood for. And how could I stand up and tell young kids or people who are ostracised, you can actually be who you are? So that was a really important point. And we had to deal with a lot of things. Like there were some things that are really unsavoury, but we got in. And I keep saying we because it wasn't me, it was a whole effort, it was a community effort, and a lot of people who weren't really engaged in politics. So the thing that I love to do more than anything else is to try and reach out, especially to those who feel marginalised, to those who feel like they might miss out, that there is an opportunity for them, that this is the people's house, that everybody can be here, and that you don't have to be sitting here in Parliament to actually make a difference. They're the things that inspire me, they're the things that motivate me, and I'll pick up on something that all of my colleagues will say. We all come here through different directions. We all might, barrack for a different party, but ultimately every one of the 93 members who sits in here really wants to make a difference and wants to make things better, and that's actually the thing that we find most common. So I'm really looking forward to today, and hopefully, we give you a great insight to what Parliament is.
Okay, well, that's a really great introduction to everybody here. Look, everyone's come here for different reasons in different ways. So now we want to actually understand, well, once you got here, what was your expectation? How did you think things worked? And then how did it actually pan out once you actually started working here? Does anybody in particular want to take the stand first?
Well, we could do this.
Should we stand up a bit and have a chat? Come on, let's have a chat. Otherwise,
Because I mean, I think it'll differ from.
it feels weird to all stand up at the same time. But anyway, we're only allowed one at a time up here.
And
so
normally
it feels
finger
very
pointing or
strange.
something.
Totally. Anyway,
well,
keep
yeah, over that side they stand up more than one at a time, but they are usually finger pointing.
Yeah.
But I think depending on whether you're a member of government or opposition or crossbench, it might change your perspective a little bit. But
Totally.
I think the expectation versus reality. I liken a lot of what we do to turning a cruise ship. Okay, if you're trying to solve an issue for a constituent, maybe a small one like you had with the gentleman with the vision problem, or a serious issue in your electorate, often it's incremental change because the department and the government is so big that a lot of things don't happen with the snap of your fingers. And maybe that was one of the biggest things for me, because from an outsider looking in, you would think, oh, surely you just
Make a phone call.
make a phone call. And sometimes it's as easy
Sometimes
as
you
that.
can though, right?
Yeah,
And that's,
absolutely.
from my perspective, that's what shocked me a lot. Because I think I came in, and there's obviously the Daily Telegraph version of what a Greens MP is. And then there was the Daily Telegraph version of what a Newtown Greens MP is. And so there was a real sense that when I came in, people were quite surprised, I think, that I was like able to sort of follow the rules. You know, to a greater or lesser extent, that I
Is that true,
waited
Mr.
and
Speaker?
did it.
Am I-
Come
I
on,
said-
no,
I said
all the
Mr.
time. No, all the
Speaker.
time that I'm a rule follower, unless the rules need to be broken. But and I think that it is, and I was really surprised to see once that sort of initial barrier breaks down, and then you get to see, oh, actually, I realise that there are people in the chamber that have a respect for the fact that you are working very hard for your community and are principled about the things you care about, and then the opportunities to actually have the chance to pick up the phone and say, can we sort this out, or can we do this, open up. It's obviously very different if you're not in the government, but I do feel like that, to me, the respect that I have for the ministers and the ministers' officers that treat every member in this place, if they have a constituent issue or an issue in their electorate, equally, it doesn't matter what party you're from, was a welcome surprise to me. Sadly, not all ministers do that, but that was an absolutely welcome surprise, the one that's did, and they get a huge amount of respect, and I think they're better as ministers as a result of doing that.
Yeah. Well, it's the point, isn't it? That we're saying like the reason that we're all here for is to actually work out a way of doing it. And the best thing that I found about Parliament is the opportunity then to see the ministers and the members, the members opposite, and just to have a conversation. And what you'll see as a quick grab on the news usually are people in here shouting and screaming and whatever. That's one part, one very, very small part of what we actually do in Parliament and outside of Parliament. And there's any number of conversations that all of us have had with colleagues who say, look, can we just sort out this problem? Because what might seem like a small problem to somebody is actually the biggest problem that they've got in their life at the moment. And that's the important thing to keep in context, that it will happen. I mean, I remember once, the health minister was terrific. I had it seems to me I've all got the health issues, but a lady came to see me because she had problems with her teeth, and it was really having difficulty getting in. But the effect that it was having on her was it was destroying her self-esteem, which was then affecting some mental health, and as a result also wasn't eating. When you've got a good relationship with people and you try and sort things out, things can be sorted out. Nobody intentionally puts roadblocks in front of you. What we see in here during that 45 minutes of question time is, people on this side of the house trying to, say the deficiencies on this side of the house and vice versa. But that's the part of the theatre of it as well. Look, at the end of the day, it is very, very competitive. I want to be sitting on that side next time. I don't want to stay sitting on this side.
Sorry,
I want to, that's where I want to, and they don't want to go to that side.
Do better, we want you on that side too.
That's kind of, that's what happens there. But the other thing that I was really surprised when I first came in, and I didn't have that real political background. Best bit of advice I got was from somebody who'd been a really an experienced MP, had said, just spend a little bit of time sitting in the chamber and sit down and just listen. And I did that for about the first 2 weeks. I just literally set up the back. Then I moved into different seats to see what it felt like in different places, and would just listen to people speak and learning the rules. Learning the rules has been the biggest problem, and I know Mr. Speaker sometimes picks on me. Actually, no, he rarely does. But getting to know the rules is a really important thing that we can do. But
What was it like you coming in, Felicity? Come on.
Well, I had a bit of exposure to Parliament itself because I'd played such a representative role in the Liberal Party. So our Women's Council would meet here in the theatre rec downstairs every month. So I was quite actively involved in the party. I knew a lot of staffers, a lot of ministers, but it's very different when you come in here. And obviously I'd seen Question Time, I'd seen the adversarial interactions and the kind of aggression in my view.
Yeah.
I think the thing that surprised me the most was that the people who are rude and offensive to your face think that they can walk out and be mates with you outside. My personality will never reconcile with that. I just have a very core value about respect, and I think you can battle ideas, you can snipe a little bit at each other, but there's a real nastiness that some members display. And the tactics that they use to try and undermine you as individuals or undermine our colleagues and ministers, I would never find acceptable. Yeah. And I am always going to be polite to people outside the chamber as well, but it's like people want to act as though they can be your friends. Yeah. And I just think that early on that was very stark to me. I think it's been a bit more normalised for me since I've been here a period of time. I don't like to think that it would become normalised for me or others over, in perpetuity. I don't think I really accept it, but you put up with it, which I think is sad because I think it enables a culture in this place where people can be demeaned, degraded, quite personal, nasty attacks thrown from the backbenches of either sides, frankly, about people's personal lives and things like that. Allegations of corruption and lies and everything else, really nasty stuff. And it's quite normalised. I don't think that's actually what people in the community want us to behave like. I used to bring a lot of school children in, and I always had to have the caveat to them beforehand, this is not how you should behave, and try and explain there's theatre. I don't actually personally think it's particularly theatrical. No. I don't think it's effective. I don't think it creates a good working environment or leads to outcomes. Because as Jihad says, we all want to get outcomes for our communities, so why are we undermining the intent of somebody opposite us that's trying to do that?
It's also, I think that's the other thing, and I know that people refer to this place as the bear pit, and it's kind of, a bit in jest and be like, oh, that's what it's like. Like, it got that perspective also from a time when there were no women sitting in this chamber. And I think there is also another side of that I also feel, just in terms of sitting in, like, crossbench usually sit in the back and the middle. And so one of the things that, often happens is the level of what are truly horrific and offensive comments coming from the backbench that you hear that obviously Mr. Speaker sitting up there can't hear are truly personal, truly horrific, truly, the kinds of things that are scandalous in terms of the comments and the interactions, but also the aggression, as you talked about, for the city. That's one thing that I really noticed is there is a physical. When I first came in here, and I'm certainly not shy, but there was a physical fear when people would get loud and aggressive, because just the sheer size of people and the number of people making a decision to whether you stand up and take a point of order or whether you push something takes
and you're also
a whole lot of courage.
The people who are opposing you at all times. So you're not facing your friends.
Yeah.
So you're facing them, and they're shouting and they're pointing and making eye contact with them. So
and there is a physical nature of it because of the
well, it's normally packed in here. When it's at its full, every one of these seats, and you're really crammed against each other.
Squished.
Then you've got this area here is also full. Then you've got the visitors galleries at the bottom level upstairs. Like when it's completely packed.
Yeah.
And
it's
interesting when you say that.
The press gallery.
Yeah, when the press gallery, and I remember the first time. So when I first started, I was sitting over there.
Yeah.
Then I was made into a Shadow Minister for Education. So I sat here, and I'll never forget the difference just from moving there to here. Like you just felt here, you were absolutely in the eye of the storm, and it was, it felt like it was all encompassing and claustrophobic. And picking up then on the points that I think Felicity, Jenny, and I'm sure James made as well. I think the clever debate that happens here is where somebody picks up on the points of order, hence if you know the rules. And that's why my homework is to get to know the rules really, really well. So you don't keep getting up and say, point of order 129.
How many standing orders do we have in the chamber?
Well, I know up to 129.
So I think about around the 360 something.
Yeah. And it's about knowing when to use them. So there's two particular MPs that I can think of who are both brilliant when they get up and debate against each other. They don't get personal, but they're very, very clever because, they refer to each other in the standing orders. And that in itself is quite good. there is an incredible amount of respect. There's been speeches when every one of us has delivered a speech and everyone on whatever side we're opposite will just listen intently. A couple of weeks ago I had to give a really moving speech. It went over time, but people were so respectful, they allowed me to have that time. People can do the right thing. Respect is the really important thing. Sometimes, and I put my hand up, sometimes I've been guilty where you get sort of caught up in the moment and you walk out and you go, you know what, I spent my whole life telling kids not to behave like that, and I behaved in a way that wasn't good enough. So there's the difference between, I think the real nasty stuff is awful, the nasty personal stuff, where some people might see this as a game. This is not a game. This is actually really important. And if you want to be clever and know your debate, know how to debate really cleverly, because that's
Play the
actually
ball,
an
not the
intellectual.
man.
Yeah,
Play the
it's a
ball,
really
yeah,
intellectual thing.
And it takes more discipline to not take the lazy approach and do the sledge on the personality-based issue or whatever it might be. And I think that often what comes to mind with me is how would I behave if the gallery was full of my constituents? Like, they would be appalled at some of the stuff that goes on in here. And that's certainly how I also try and view the job. In fact, there's kind of two elements. There's what we do in here, and there's what we do when we go back to the electorate office. And I think they're two very, very different outputs in what you need to do and how you need to participate. But I think politics today, you will be more rewarded if you're disciplined and considered in how you debate versus just the cheap shots. Because the media just do blanket coverage now of cheap shots and how politicians will talk to one another.
So could I take this back a little bit now, and so that we can, no doubt this is a really difficult work environment. If I had to do that every day when I went to work, I'd just be exhausted.
Oh, it's also very fun. People shouldn't be put off.
Yeah.
It's a very fun job to do.
Well,
it's
I
an
think
absolute honour
It's a
to do it.
rewarding. It's an incredibly rewarding job.
So we're going from, our initial experiences, this place is, like a tough environment. So what are some of the experiences that you have, things that have happened, things that you've done? And I've heard many members talk about committee work, working with other party members on some very interesting and difficult issues, and rewarding things that have happened to them through the work of the Parliament.
Can I mention so James and I did a really terrific... So James is from Manly and I'm from Lakemba, two very, very different parts of Sydney. He looks terrific in a pair of board shorts and rash shirt. I look uncomfortable in it. But we had, it was about a year and a half ago, and I spoke to James, because we've had a few of, people in my electorate who were going to the beach and not really knowing how to read the beach properly. And in tragic circumstances, there'd been a couple of drownings. In other circumstances, we had just kids that just would walk out and didn't know, because they hadn't grown up around the beach and hadn't necessarily gone to swimming lessons. So James and I had a bit of a chat, and James had organised for the local surf club there to run like a surf skills. And it wasn't to teach him how to surf as much as to read the surf, because it's such an important part of Australia's history and culture. And we took kids who had never been to Manly, and James was there, and the surf guys were there, and the girls, and it was such a great day, because not only did they learn something, they also saw that two people who are very different maybe when they stand here were actually trying to do something really good. And I think that's the message that can actually be sent across the community, that whilst we might argue over certain points, what we all agree on is how we can make things better. And James, you were fantastic in organising that, and the kids still talk about that. But some of those kids were kids that a lot of people had given up on, and they've now joined youth groups and things like that. So I'm so grateful for that, in terms of when you think about when we all walk out of here, we're not going to remember the smart aleck comment we made in the chamber. We're going to remember the things that we actually did that made a difference to people's lives. That's an example of something that made a difference to people's lives, and I want to thank you for that.
Yeah, well, I think that in part the way in which you managed to get that up and running was through the volunteer and community groups that are in your community. And one of the things that struck me the most has been, as an MP, the helicopter view that you get of all that's going on in your community, and the most amazing volunteer and community organisations that you simply just wouldn't know existed. And I think that some of the more privileged parts and moments of the job have evolved around helping those organisations whether it be through a small amount of funding or really setting them on the path to be able to deliver some really fantastic outcomes. But I, in hindsight, had no idea the depth in certainly in my community, I'm sure it's for you guys as well, of the goodwill of people that were out there. And it's a shame that that's not better understood. But so working with those community groups has been a good thing. And it was actually, so Tony Abbott was my federal member when I first came in, and I had a few sort of the last 2 years with him, and he gave a really good piece of advice, which was, he said, "How are you going?" I said, "Oh, it's really busy, Tony, like the phone is ringing off the hook in the electorate office." And he said, "Well, that's good, because if people are ringing you, then it's because they think you can do something. And it's better that they think you can do something and are seeking your support than, you know, nobody coming through the door or ringing you up." So it was just interesting bit of feedback that stuck with me.
I think the other part to me about the community work and the connections is also being able to connect, like in that example, but more generally, to feel like you have an incredible privilege to be able to meet with so many people in your community, so many organisations. You're connected in with community leaders, like informal leaders and also formal leaders. And I think part of that means that I see part of my role as trying to connect people in. So, you know, being able to hear that, you know, we've got the social outfit, which is in Newtown, which is a social enterprise that teaches refugees and migrant women to get retail work experience and also make high-end fashion. And then hearing from them and hearing, okay, right, you've got this thing. They're like, you know, okay, you need support with this. All right, great, I know this person. Can I get them to come and chat to you? None of that is formal and part of the job description. That to me is about, and you know, this was the measure when I first was running for election, was I didn't want to put in all this effort to running an election that meant that if we didn't win, that there would be nothing to show for what we did during that campaign, because it was a year of intense campaigning. And so for me, it was one of our goals during the election campaign was to create connections and skills and strength in the community. So even if we didn't win, the community would have more skills and more strength to be able to run the campaigns whether or not we were elected. And that mindset of trying to keep building those connections and capacity, so it is almost, if you like, not necessary for us to be there because the strength is between the people in the community that are leading, to me is what I always keep first and foremost in the type of work we do. But on a practical level, one thing that I think is really interesting as a kind of example of that kind of stuff was during COVID, we had a couple of, as most people did, like a couple of cafes or a pizza place that had a scare and then needed to shut down. The ability to get on the phone to someone in the health minister's office, have the head of the local health district ring me because the guy who ran the pizza shop was feeling particularly stressed because he hadn't got the right information, being able to connect with him on social media, say, right, let me find it out, we'll be back in touch. And I remember one night, I was literally 11 o'clock at night, sitting in my car because I'd got home from some other thing, and had someone from the health district ring me and say, okay, should I ring now? Do you want to ring back? Should we do it tomorrow morning? We'll send someone down there. And just the ability to be able to do that and connect people so that by the morning, responding to that crisis had been sorted out and then they were supported in the way they were. Like that kind of stuff feels like that's the meaningful things, right?
Absolutely.
And anyone had any experiences working on committees?
Go for it. You're the queen of committees, Felicity, all 6 at the beginning of the year.
I think that we do often focus quite closely in our own communities. It's predominantly the reason that we're here. But committee work is one of the things that helps us look statewide. And I think it's really valuable for us to see issues that impact other parts of the state when we're making these whole of government decisions and policy approaches. So one of when the committees come together, we're cross-party. 2 of my committees are chaired by independents, for instance, and we'll take on particular topics, might be referred by government, might be determined from within the committee membership of policy areas that we think we need to deep dive, consider change. And one of the ones I was just thinking about was when I was on the committee for children and young people, and it was actually before I was pregnant, but I fell pregnant during that, so it then became very eye-opening to me about what happens when you have a baby and et cetera, et cetera. I already knew you got a blue book when they arrive. I wouldn't have known that apart from the committee. But
you knew more than me when I had mine.
But that committee, for instance, we went on site visits. We usually do, so we choose a couple of locations, and so we went up to the Central Coast where there's a statistically higher proportion of younger parents, teen parents and things like that. So we went to some of the different services that work in community and government services for teen parents, for instance. We went to a couple of different locations. We went to see some different Indigenous service providers to understand what's happening with Indigenous mothers and fathers and Indigenous children. And we went to look at different health services. And it was really eye-opening for those of us who spend all of our time in our electorate, and it can be very inward focused in doing that, because that's the predominant reason that we're here, and we have to speak out for those interests. But then we came to a number of different final outcomes, and we made a lot of recommendations, and you work as a committee cross-party, making, can go line by line, making some decisions about what you'll recommend, and sometimes opposition members might want to push more aggressively against the government, but not, I found in my experience, not to that great of an extent. It's not particularly adversarial at all, it's very collaborative. I think that opposition members probably acknowledge that if the government has the numbers on the committee, you're best to try and work on something constructive coming out at the end rather than taking shots. The upper house is a completely different matter, but that's what we do in the lower house. And from that inquiry, one of the things that I was really supportive of was around perinatal depression and anxiety for mothers and fathers, and parents. And so one of the recommendations that we made, the government did take on fairly shortly after, and that was about mother-baby units within hospitals to ensure that mothers could be kept with their baby if they had acute psychotic episodes or needed acute psychiatric treatment. Up until that point, there was only one private centre in New South Wales on a long waiting list. And if you had need of psychiatric treatment following the birth of a child, you would then be separated, which has a significant impact on attachment and the well-being of the mother in particular. So by us working all together, and we saw this need, and we got to look at other jurisdictions, we were able to come out with something that we collaborated on. We made the case to ministers within government, and then policy decisions were made to implement that. I'd like to see some more mother-baby units across the state. But we saw an outcome there, and an outcome that didn't have to come by attacking the government or needling them. It didn't have to come by me as a local member saying, well, I need this in my electorate, which is often what we're arguing for, because I didn't need it in my electorate. I needed it to serve the people of New South Wales. Yeah. So that's just one example where I feel like that will be a tangible impact on people's lives and well-being. And those are the things you can achieve by working within the committees.
Yeah.
Good work.
Yeah. It is, but you saying about working across parties, like I was just on the inquiry into reviewing the homelessness protocol, and there were quite a number of new members that were just elected at the last election. And for the Greens, I hold the housing and homelessness policies area. So basically, I spend most of my life when I'm not doing Newtown related things looking at housing policy statewide. And so obviously, I had a lot of understanding of who the key players were in the state, a lot of key understanding of what the issues were and the things were that some of the newer members might not have. And so I was given the opportunity through the fact that it was the committee process to actually feed in, look, I think these stakeholders need to be approached to peer witnesses. And a lot of that was just accepted as, yep, I had that expertise and the knowledge of who were the right people. And then with the recommendations, probably a good, 10 to 15 either amendments or insertions in the recommendations came out of stuff that I had put the effort into pulling out of what had been there in that committee report, and were supported because they weren't controversial things. They were just in terms of the level of depth people had it as an understanding of that area versus what could come out of it. And I think, to me, that gave me a sense of comfort that those inquiries are really valuable when people recognise that putting heads together is a good thing, right? And trying to share that knowledge is a good thing.
I suppose that's the advantage of the committee's process, and that's what it's all about, trying to find out what's the problem, how can we make it better, and rather than try and do it in a question, say, in Parliament, where you've got a 5-minute response and lots of different things, say, everybody's got a good idea. Jenny will have a good idea, Jane will have a good idea, Felicity will have a good idea that I might not know about, but actually when we're sitting down together, so the collaborative thing, but the mother-child unit you're talking about, this is something that you've brought as a passion of yours, but you've been able to make it happen. So sometimes you could sit in Parliament and think, well, what is it that I'm actually changing? What difference am I actually making? This is a very tangible difference that's being made, and that's one of those legacy things that will actually make a difference to people's lives. So there is a lot of benefit in committees because you look at things in detail and you try and work out how you can improve things. And the fact that you come to a committee means that you actually are trying to find a solution. Well, we're all solutions based. That's what we're trying to do, create solutions that make life better for everybody.
Okay, that's really fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I'm become aware that we haven't had a question from the audience. I think we should have someone ask a question from the audience and see if there's something we haven't really addressed in our
Don't be
discussion.
shy, you can just yell out from the back.
That's what we do.
We always yell out, yeah.
Firstly, thank you so much for coming and having this session. It's been really interesting.
Thank you.
And thank you for your honesty about some of the discussion you mentioned that happens in the back benches and maybe some of the nastiness. And I'm wondering, is there any training session, any adjustment, or any people that help you adjust when you become a new member of this parliament, maybe from past members, from both sides that might help the new members, and maybe moral behaviour that.
Well, good behaviour.
You get-
That's a great
you get
question,
a day of,
actually.
You get a day of new parliament school. I
No,
don't know
no,
what happens
not
if you come in,
a
if you get an
by-election.
election in a by-election. I think you're in trouble. But Jihad and I went to new parliament school for a day together. It was certainly
First day of school. wasn't it?
feels completely overwhelming. You're too busy trying to suss out, whoever it is and how it all works to actually take much in. So, there is that. There's obviously various types of professional development and other roles that are given to members of parliament, but there's no job description. And there's no ability to someone to say, okay, here are the basics of what's expected you in the role. So for myself, I was very lucky because when I was elected, there was already one Green, my Greens colleague Jamie Parker had already been elected the election before. But when he first came in, he literally came in as the first Green into this chamber in the lower house ever. And in the upper house, the Greens had representatives, and in the upper house during question time, not all the members go to question time.
Oh.
And so he tells the story of the first question time of his first being elected. He didn't know that that's what you did. He thought you went if you had a question, because that's what they do in the upper house. And someone rang him and said, Jamie, it's question time, where are you? And I think he luckily he's a very tall person with long strides, so he made it in. But little things like that, literally people, unless you have other people to tell you these things informally, you're pretty much working those things out. But I remember our email opened on the first day and we had public housing inquiries because officers had maybe, potentially people that were trying to win the election who didn't win the election thought they would immediately refer all these matters to us. And so we had an inbox full of constituent related matters and we didn't have a letterhead or an email signature or anything.
Yeah.
But it's a baptism of fire in one sense.
Informal mentoring, and as you say, I guess it
Totally.
depends the way in which you've come to this place. James and I, in our own way, had different relationships with our colleagues and even staff members and things like that. So coming in, I off my own bat, I went and spent a day in some of my different colleagues' electorate offices to just observe the way they did the job, even things like, well, what type of website do you have? What type of stationery do you have? What type of phone calls do you receive? So I did those kinds of things. And here in the Parliament, I asked a lot of people, well, what am I meant to be speaking on? And how often should I be speaking? And, how active should I be? And I just asked a lot of people those questions, but that's because I had existing relationships. One of the things that Mr. Speaker's doing now is, as Jenny mentioned, is instituting a number of professional development courses, which are not so much for your first day, but the goal of that is to try and some of them are about trying to improve the quality of our polity generally, and some are about specific individual skills development to try and progress you in your career. And I come from a corporate background, so that makes sense to me because that's the way that you look at investing in yourself in a corporate environment. But the predominance of what you learn and pick up about the way in which this place works and the way you should function it and also utilise it to leverage it for your community is really learned on the job, depending on how well you have those relationships and if someone will proactively take you under their wing. But also a lot of our colleagues have been here quite a while now, so they forget what it's like to be new, so they don't know what you don't know.
Totally.
So a lot of it, as G had said, is sitting around observing and trying to know which questions to ask and asking lots of questions.
Yeah. Like you see in question time, everyone was like signing and thing, and I was like, what's that all about? Like people would rock up and you'd watch and be like, what are they doing over there? What's all those things? And then it's like, oh, okay, so people send like birthday cards to their electorate or welcome letters, but you just have to basically get up the courage and go, oh, what's that thing you've got there you're signing? And then you're like, oh, that's a thing. People do.
Well, we had an interesting one as well. Like I'd always been really wary of Facebook and all that sort of stuff, and I didn't have any social media before I went for a in Parliament. And I remember even before my campaign launch, somebody who was going to help me out said, "You've got to open up a Facebook page." I said, "I don't want to. That's my personal life." And I was very insistent on the rules. I said, "Look, I don't want it to be. It's not too political. I don't want it to be a family thing. It's just going to be who I am." And eventually, sort of agreed to it. But I also want to touch on that idea that, you know, you can have different mentors, but you've also got to make sure that you pick the right person to ask for advice to. And I think it shouldn't matter that because I'm a Labor member, the only person I'm going to speak to is a Labor member of Parliament. If there's somebody who's doing really well, or I admire the way they conduct themselves, or I think I can learn something from them, they'll do that. And the collegiality of this place actually works a bit like that. I've had members from the Coalition ask for advice, and I've asked members of the Coalition. You know, I've done some things with Jenny as well, where if you can learn different things from each other and you become better, then it's good. The other thing that, and Felicity, that you touched on, Mr. Speaker's professional development program, which is in the form of listening to some people who are doing really well, a constant reminder of why we're here. The reason we're here is because we actually want to make things better. But how do you conduct yourself as well? And sometimes it's just a reminder as to the reasons that you can conduct yourself a little bit better. I noticed there was an email that went out last week about some ethics training. And it's you know, you're thinking, of course, it's a no-brainer. We should all be doing it. But those sorts of things that need to come up, constantly working on, I think are really important. But in terms of walking in with an actual, you know, ticker box bag, you don't have it. You need to learn that. And there's a lot of people here who are willing to help. And I've got to also give a shout out to, you know, the clerks and the assistants. They're like some of the unsung heroes here. That whenever you're not sure about the rules and how things work properly, they're really terrific at giving you the proper advice. And I've gone to them a few times just to think, say, can I do this, or can't I do this, or how does this work? So it is a very, very collegial place, and that's how you learn. And based on what Felicity was saying, but we all have very similar experiences, I would say.
Although, as a new member, there are also a few larrikins in here. And I recall sitting up on the back bench there in my first couple of days, and a note got passed to me, and it just said, "Will you please go and see this particular minister after question time?" And I thought, oh,
Principal's office.
Something's got, this can't be good. So I've marched down there and walked into his office and, what are you doing here? And someone just wrote the note and made me go down there and turn up. So, that person then did put their hand up and say, "I got you pretty good on that one, didn't I?" But I think on Jihad's point, the parliamentary staff here, because the learning curve, even going back to civics that you learnt in high school, and then if you studied politics or had an interest in it, actually how policy is made and how bills are passed and formed, and what on earth, why do we refer to this place as this place and
the other place?
The other place, and the curiosities and the quirks of the actual chamber and its customs, learning that and understanding that. And I think then from that flows the history, and I think the gravity, you know, that comes with this being the oldest parliament in the country. So, yeah, it's a steep learning curve, but there is no shortage if you have enough initiative and get up and go to be able to go and find the answers and get the support that you need.
I think just very, very quickly, the other thing is that you come into this place knowing that the people that are here are guaranteed to have not voted for you, right? So you come in here with a confidence. You come in here with a confidence of knowing that you're in here not to impress or represent or do anything for the people that are here. And so I think there is also a confidence and a responsibility that comes with that, that even though you have no idea about the rules of this place when you come in, and even though you feel like you're not really sure how any of it works, you come in it from a position of having the confidence of your community to have given you the opportunity to be here to represent them. So no matter how terrifying all of that might be, in terms of all the processes and everything else, you know that you've got a job to do here because you've convinced an entire community that represent that you're up for that challenge. So actually, you know, if you have to look a bit embarrassed because you don't know the rules quite right, or you don't know that you're supposed to send people birthday cards, for the record, I don't do that. Sorry to people of Newtown, but I decided I wasn't into that. But yeah, like I think that is also the strength that we all come, even if you don't know what you're doing when you first come in here.
Okay.
You reminded me, I was going to say, James reminded me just of something that happened that was really funny. Talk about the larrikins, and I don't really, you might remember this. So we had one of our members had this terror, he'd virtually lost his voice. and it's really noisy in question time.
This
and
is pre-COVID, so he was allowed
this
to
is
be
well,
in
yeah,
there.
yeah, well before COVID. But and he's quite he's quite a character in himself. So he was given a question that day in Parliament, and it's so loud. But he's come down to the microphone and he could hardly speak, and he's just having to talk into the microphone, and nobody could actually hear him. So the poor person, he struggled away, and it wasn't like the most like it wasn't the most hard hitting of the questions. But there are funny things that happen. People take it seriously, but at the end of the day, we're all human beings. We all actually have a little bit of a laugh. We all have lives outside of what we do here. And when we actually get to know each other on a bit more of a personal level, we respect each other for the things that we stand for, and we see that what we do in here sometimes is argue certain points, not argue individuals. And that humour thing, I just think about some of the funny things that have happened here.
Okay, look, sadly, we've come to the end of our time. So perhaps people might want to stay back and speak to some of the members.
Sure.
But we have to sign off online. So thank you to everybody who joined us online and everybody here in the live audience too. We'll have more of these, so keep your eyes out for our programs on our website and join our mailing list, etc., etc. I think we have a newsletter as well now on the Parliament Education page. So thank you to everybody who participated today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And of course, thank you to all the members.